Thank you for taking your seats. We're about to start the conference. Thank you so much for taking your seats. We're about to start right now with the welcome remarks by Ahmed Al-Sayed. My name is Hiba Hani. Sarah, Marriott, and I are the conference managers, and please, if you need anything throughout the coming days, don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you. Ahmed Al-Sayed.
Okay. Oh, sorry. This is much better. So yeah, my name is Ahmed Said, and I have the privilege of welcoming you today in my dual capacity as a professor at the American University in Cairo and as the executive director of JPAL MENA at AUC. With one hat, I stand before you as a researcher and scholar committed to advancing the fields of development and labor economics. With the other, I proudly represent JPAL, an organization dedicated to generating rigorous evidence to inform policy decisions that can improve lives around the world. It's truly a delight to greet you all on behalf of both institutions and welcome you all to what I hope will be an engaging, enriching, and productive exchange of ideas. Today, as we gather here in Cairo, it gives me a great pleasure to open the 7th edition of the Jobs and Development Conference, hosted this year by JPAL MENA at AUC. This event has grown into one of the most important platforms for researchers, policymakers, and development practitioners to come together and discuss critical issues related to jobs and inclusive economic growth. Since 2016, the conference has been held in diverse and dynamic settings, including Washington, D.C., Bonn, Bogota, Cape Town. Each of these locations brought its own unique character to the conference, shaping discussions that have led to meaningful insights and contributions to the global understanding of labor markets and economic development. And now, we're excited that the conference comes for the first time to the Middle East and North Africa region. We are deeply proud to host this year's event in a city with such rich history, cultural significance, and a pivotal role in the region's development. We hope that this year's conference will stand as a landmark event, continuing the tradition of excellence established by its predecessors, and perhaps setting new standards for future editions. In selecting the theme for this year's conference, I would like to thank my colleagues for their creativity. We wanted to draw from Egypt's own heritage and history, and we chose to focus on the ancient Egyptian gods, Sishet and Tahut. Sishet, here, is the goddess of books and knowledge, represents the art of record keeping and the scientific method, something we, as researchers, are too familiar with. Tahut is the god of wisdom, writing, and judgment, and was believed to be the scribe of the gods, recording events and facts with absolute accuracy. Both deities symbolize the power of knowledge, scholarship, and the importance of precision and rigor, which aligns perfectly with our goals and the spirit of inquiry we seek to foster during this conference. Here we gather not only to exchange ideas and present our findings, but also to pursue truth in its most rigorous form through the lens of data, evidence, and research, aiming to further our understanding and shape future policies. As a researcher in the field of labor economics, I have spent much of my career exploring the fundamental role that jobs play in economic development, especially in emerging and developing countries. Employment is more than just a means of earning a living or earning a livelihood. It's the foundation of economic stability, social mobility, and inclusive growth. In Egypt, as in many other countries, labor markets are at the heart of any developmental change. Particularly now, when we face critical questions about how to create jobs that are productive, sustainable, and equitable. These questions are not merely academic, they strike at the core of what we must achieve to ensure the prosperity for future generations. For developing countries like Egypt, labor market reforms, education, and skills development are crucial. The research to be presented at this conference will delve into these topics and many more, offering insights and potential solutions to the challenges we face. I hope that the discussions we will be having will inform not only the academic research, but also tangible policy changes that can improve lives across the region and beyond. This year, we are fortunate to have gathered more than 100 scholars, experts, and practitioners from around the world. Each of you brings a unique perspective, grounded in your respective areas of research and practice. The diversity of thought and experience present in this room is what makes this conference so special. Over these 2 days, we will have the opportunity to hear from experts on a wide range of topics, from labor market dynamics to education, from migration to gender equity, etc. These discussions will be invaluable in advancing our collective understanding of labor economics and development. And hopefully, they will lay the groundwork for future research and policies that can address the most pressing issues facing our world today. I encourage each of you to take a full advantage of this opportunity, to engage with your fellow participants, share your insights, and challenge one another. It's through these exchanges we will not only enrich our understanding, but also drive the innovations that can shape the future of labor and development economics. Finally, I would like to extend my deepest thanks to the organizing team whose tireless efforts have made this event possible. We are fortunate to have a team of dedicated individuals who have worked behind the scene to bring this all together. Once again, I warmly welcome you all to the 2024 Jobs and Development Conference. Whether you have traveled from far or joining us virtually, we are so grateful to have you here. Thank you, and welcome again to Egypt and AUC. It's now my pleasure to introduce the executive committee who will be guiding us through the next 2 days, and I'll give the floor to Gary Fields.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Fields. In previous years, I came up to the podium as a representative of IZA, which had been a co-sponsor of this conference. IZA is no longer a co-sponsor of this conference, and so I'm here in my personal capacity as a professor at Cornell University. These conferences, as you just heard from Ahmed, go back to 2016 and before. 2016 was when the Network on Jobs and Development and the World Bank came together to organize conferences. Previously, going back to 2006, IZA and the World Bank had been running a conference. It was called Conference on Labor and Development rather than Jobs and Development, but I regard that as just a change of name. The point remained the same, and that is that economic development could be conceptualized as improving people's material standards of living. For most people, the most important determinant of their material standard of living is how much they earn for the work they do. And so tying the labor market agenda together with the development agenda was part and parcel of what this conference has been doing. And so we continue to do it. I continue to find it exciting, fascinating, and Ahmed, I thank you and everybody else who are giving us the opportunity to discuss this here in Cairo. Thank you very much.
Federica, yes. Here you go.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 edition of our Jobs and Development Conference. I'm delighted to be here with so many esteemed colleagues and experts to discuss one of the most complex challenges of our time, jobs and economic development. I'm here actually joined by several World Bank colleagues. We also have our Regional Director for Prosperity in the Middle East and North Africa region, Nadir Mohammed, and I can't see, but I have several colleagues who will present our work today and tomorrow. But we really would like to learn from you. This conference and the partnership has been very important for us over the years, has been such a unique platform to discuss the complex jobs agenda through your innovative and cutting-edge research. And I would like to say just two particular reasons why for the World Bank this is very, very important, this annual or biannual gathering over the past years. Unfortunately, to skip 1 year. So the first reason is that the growing prominence of the jobs agenda within the World Bank Group. 10 years ago, we had our first World Development Report focusing on jobs. That report really showed that there are social values to jobs. And it showed the importance of moving beyond just traditional labor market analysis. It showed that we need a holistic approach. And then fast forward in 2019, we had another World Development Report on the changing nature of work, showing importance of technology advancement for jobs and really the trade-offs between efficiency and equity. And now, with the new president, with the new leadership, we have entered a new phase. The prominence of the agenda was communicative from our president from day one. We are reorganizing as a bank. We are rethinking as a bank how we can serve better and solve better this issue. And so those inputs, what we learned from you during this, let me repeat it, a unique platform to reflect on the jobs agenda is very important. The second one is the importance of continued investment into knowledge. We always say development reaches people through jobs. And yet, unfortunately, we haven't solved the jobs challenge. This battle, we haven't won it. There is no one solution for jobs. It's really a matter of understanding, what are the priorities depending on the country context, depending on the interplay of many factors. Hence, the knowledge that we learn here is a key input. You help us understand what works, in which context, and how we can be more effective. So your work is really important to guide us through these ongoing and new challenges and opportunities, right? Because we know there are a lot of opportunities to be leveraged. So with that, I won't take too much time. I look forward to promising to be 2 days of interesting and enlightening discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federica. And now the word is for Jeff Johnson from ILO.
Well, thank you, Ahmed. It's good to be with you. My full name is Lawrence Jeff Johnson, so if you get confused, don't worry about it. I was 5 years old before I knew my name was Lawrence, so if you look me up, you can find me that way. No, it's good to be back in Cairo, and also this is to be back with the conference and the team. You know, we in the ILO joined this discussion, this event, kind of late in the game, but we welcome the opportunity. The ILO, we often say labor is not a commodity, and we treat it as such. And we need to look at how we have an inclusive growth model that looks at not only growth and economic inclusion, but also society and the environment. As such, these types of conferences are vital for us. We need to make sure that we move forward in a holistic approach. With our new Director General, we are looking at the issue of advancing social justice, looking about how economic growth can serve society while protecting the environment, including everyone. Today's conference, in the next 2 days, we have a number of papers being presented. I'm joined here by several colleagues from the ILO. But more importantly, the papers that we reviewed, we found quite interesting. There were so many papers that we could not select everyone. So the committee has already had a brief discussion how we can expand in the future. But our job here today is not only just to give you an insight to some of our work and our priorities, but really to listen to you, see where you are finding the research that we can find useful to develop partnerships. So on that note, let me thank you for joining us both here in person, but I know we have many colleagues joining us virtually. So again, thank you, and I look forward to 2 days of discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence. And now the word is for Kunal Sen from UNU-WIDER.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Ahmed El Sayed, American University Cairo, and JPAL MENA for hosting this conference in the historic city of Cairo. It's just wonderful to be here, and this lovely campus, which Ahmed says to me is a fairly recent campus, the American University Cairo. So it's really, really pleasing to be here, and thanks so much, Ahmed, and the team who've been working non-stop along with colleagues from University of Cape Town for the conference. So UNU-WIDER is delighted to be one of the lead institutions supporting this conference. We came in a little bit later than the World Bank and the Network of Jobs and Development, but when we did, we were absolutely committed to this conference because the agenda of this conference is very much linked to our own work, especially around SDG 8, decent work and inclusive growth. It's a fundamental SDG we think very, very important, is a very important SDG among others. And the work on the question of good jobs that Federica mentioned is a challenge that we need to understand. We're talking about a world where, at least in Africa and in Asia, 85% of workers are in the informal sector, precarious livelihoods, et cetera, and very, very difficult working conditions. And we don't really yet have a solution to exactly how we should address those sorts of challenges. And this conference is an innovative platform that we think is very important for bringing together scholars and policymakers around the challenge of good jobs in developing countries. And if you go outside and see our publications for the last 5 years or so, we have several projects, books, journal articles, special issues on this challenge of good jobs, on informality and women's work and so on. Something that we've been committed to. And in our current work program, which is on one of the major themes is inequality, seen through the lens of labor markets in particular. That's a particular focus we bring in the work on inequality in UNU-WIDER. So much more to come, actually, for us. We started the work program this year, and we're going to carry on this work for the next few years. Now, from my own personal view, personal perspective, because I've been attending the Jobs and Development Conference for many, many years now, what I really think has been so pleasing for me, we saw this in Cape Town 2 years back, we see it here, is that this has become a conference of a global community of scholars that particularly are now drawing several presenters from the Global South. That wasn't really the case at the beginning. And I think that's been fantastic. And for that, we need to thank GIZ because they have given us generous funding, both in Cape Town 2 years back and now, that we can bring in scholars from the Global South, especially in Africa, to this conference. And also the support that each of us provide, our institutions, the World Bank, ILO, the Network on Jobs and Development, and UNU-WIDER, has also been very important in making sure this is a Global South-driven conference. And I think it's one of the best things we've seen in the last several years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kunal. Now I give the word, last but definitely not least, Harun Purat from DPRU, University of Cape Town.
Thanks very much, Ahmed. And of course, just to echo everybody, thank you to JPAL MENA and AUC for hosting us. It's been wonderful so far. I was given the final word, and in thinking about platitudes which academics are not used to, I thought, let me just reflect on this conference, and it struck me that for three really important reasons, this is almost, maybe unbeknown to some of you, this is almost a threshold conference for us, given that we've run through it so many years, given that we've had it for so many years. The first is it's the highest number of submissions we've had by far. So I asked Sarah for the data, and just so you know, we had 518 submissions. Now, if you ask the average person that you speak to in your family, they'd barely know what labor economics is, right? Never mind labor economics in developing countries, right? So 518 submissions, that is a 55% increase from the Cape Town conference. So a massive increase. The acceptance rate, so it's a little bit like you guys getting into Harvard. The acceptance rate is 12%, right? So there are very few papers that were accepted. And in fact, what really was heartening for me is that over 60% of the submissions, which was Kunal's point, actually came from Africa and Asia. So we had a strong bias in terms of submissions from the developing world. And I don't think the final acceptance rate deviated from that share. And the process was a double-blind review, so we were quite careful in who was selected and so on. So if you run through the papers and you run through the conference, I think the quality is incredibly high. So I think that's something really important we should be proud of. But it's a threshold conference for a second reason, and I've just come from Kunal celebrating Gary's retirement, amongst other things, where one of Gary's students said this to me. He said to me, why is it when I write a paper that says the impact of minimum wages in the US, I'm a labor economist. But if I say the impact of minimum wages in Mexico, I'm a development economist. So what happened? I'm still using Carter and Kruger, I'm still using all the tools, but I'm a development economist. And we had this conversation, and it struck me that if you look at the recent journals at least, right, the top 5 journals at least, that's changing. Ravi Kanbur has a great piece called The End of Development Economics. It's a blog at CPR. Talks a little bit about that, right? The credibility revolution, the tools we're using are all the same, and journals are listening. So I think it's a threshold point for the conference as well, is that we are no longer sort of development economists, but we are labor economists working in developing country settings, because the tools are the same tools that every other labor economist is using, and perhaps slowly, journals are changing with respect to that. And relatedly, and then I'll stop there, it's a threshold conference for a third reason that Kunal will pick up on later, but the steering committee, which is essentially the donors plus the Southern partners, the Network for Jobs and Development that I represent here, have been speaking about for a while, is that maybe we are a community now of developing country or labor economists working on developing country issues. And so should we not have a society? You have EAL, I think it's called, and you have SOL for the American labor economists, but we don't have one for developing country economists. And Kunal will talk a little bit about that, but I think that's an exciting opportunity for us. So just for me, in closing, just to thank the donors in particular, the big hitters, the World Bank, WIDER, and ILO, without which I think this wouldn't have been possible, and particularly the Germans, who came in very quietly but very efficiently and have really supported the travelers from the south who found it difficult to get here. But thank you very much, and I hope the next few days will be as good as they promise. Thanks.
So it's my pleasure now to start the academic discussions and the academic lecturing by having our keynote speaker for today, Professor David Lam, who's like a big name in the areas of economics and demography. Professor Lam, the floor is yours. We are so much looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, Ahmed. Thanks to American University Cairo for hosting, and to the wonderful group of sponsors. I've been to many of these conferences, including this incarnation and the previous incarnation that Gary Fields referred to. They're always great, and it was a real honor to be invited to give a keynote address this morning. No? Okay. Very good. Okay, so great pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation. I look forward to the 2 days. There we go. So I'm going to talk a lot, just go back to the title. The title is The Global Labor Market and the End of World Population Growth. So there's hopefully something provocative there for you to think about, and hopefully it will convince you that this topic makes sense. I'm using, throughout the paper, the latest population projections from the United Nations Population Division, which is kind of the gold standard in population estimation and projections. And in their latest release, which just came out in this July, 2024, they project that the world population is going to peak at 10.3 billion in 2084. This is just a slight change from their previous release 2 years ago. They release these every 2 years, which was 10.4 billion in 2085. So happily, these projections have not been changing a lot, so that's their projection. That's an increase of a little over 2 billion from today. And then they project that the world population will actually decline to about 10.2 billion by 2100. So they're bold enough to project out to 2100, and I will show you a lot of those projections. I want to impress on you and hopefully beat this to death before the end of the talk. This is a big deal. This is the end of centuries of sustained population growth, with some very minor exceptions. And especially the last 100 years or so of significant population growth, including really what is fair to call was a population explosion that has already kind of ended and is going to sort of pan out completely in this century. Most of this additional 2.1 billion people are going to be added in low-income and lower middle-income countries, mostly in Africa. I'll talk a lot about that. Africa's population, and I'm going to use Africa including North Africa, population is projected to increase by 2.3 times between 2024 and 2084. So using 2084, this time projected of the world reaching its maximum, almost surely forever, population. So that'll be an increase from 1.6 to 3.5 billion for Africa. and will continue to grow. So unlike the rest of the world, Africa will continue growing throughout the century, reaching almost 4 billion by 2100. Asia, by contrast, is projected to increase only 2% from now until 2084, from 4.8 to 4.9 billion, and it will be in population decline by 2054 by these projections. Obviously, there's some noise around these things, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Many countries, really most countries, almost all countries outside of Africa, will be in a period of population decline that's going to last for decades probably, by 2050. So we have a huge change on the horizon. We're really already in it, as I will show you, where population growth everywhere in the world is no longer going to be the state of affairs. And so my question in this address is, what will be the impact of these very dramatic demographic changes on the global labor market and the labor markets of particular countries and regions? So really seismic shifts I want to emphasize. So as I said, everything I'm using here uses the latest UN population projections that were released in July, but they don't look a lot different than the ones from 2 years before. Okay, so this is a graph of the change in population for a bunch of countries from now until 2084, using 2084 because it's this peak of world population, plotted against 2022 per capita income. And so I begin with countries that are going to have population growth of over 10 million people. You can see that there's a lot of red dots here down on the low end of the income scale. So most of this growth is going to be in low-income countries. Just to highlight a few, Nigeria is projected to add 232 million people. That's a doubling in this 60-year period. You can see DRC, 266 million, Pakistan, 237 million. So those are some of the big ones, Ethiopia, 202. India is projected to add 170 million, but it's worth noting that in India, that's only a 12% increase. So India's big. It's going to keep growing, but that's a pretty modest increase. And India, the end of population growth in India is very much in sight. Egypt, since we're here and very interested, is going to add 80 million. And for those of you who've been experiencing the 20 million people of Cairo, current Egyptian population is something over 100 million, so that's a 69% increase. Then if we add all the other countries with positive population growth, they're all the red countries, you can see, again, very heavily concentrated down on the low end of the world income distribution. I left a lot of room at the bottom of this graph for a reason. I'm now going to show you the countries that are going to have population decline. And there's this very glaring dot down here at the bottom, which is China. China is projected to lose 600 million people in this 60-year period, 42% decrease, almost half its population. I'm going to talk a bit about that and why that's a pretty reasonable forecast to believe. A few others to highlight. Brazil is projected to lose 23 million. That's a 13% decrease, and you can see some others there in blue on the high end. So upper middle income, high income countries mostly in decline. There's the rest of the ones that will have decline. So what do we see in the coming decades? Continued population growth for the world for a while, but very concentrated in what are now low income, lower middle income countries, and in particular Africa. And really for the first time in certainly 100 years, arguably 300 years, arguably more than that, significant population decline in much of the world. Okay. Now, I want to talk about the working age population mainly. I'm going to use the definition of 15 to 64, which is the ILO and other organizations typically use. Nothing would change here much if we changed it to 20 or 25 at the bottom, but I'll use that standard definition. Okay, and I want to make a few big picture points here about what's happened to the working age population of the world in the big regions. So for the world as a whole, as of 2020, the working age population was a little over 5 billion. You can see the rapid growth. Asia was 3 billion of that, Africa a little under 1 billion. And I want to just highlight here a 50-year period from 1970 to 2020 when the world added 3 billion people to the working age population. And I think, again, it's hard to overstate the significance of this. The world labor market absorbing 3 billion people in 50 years. And of course, that, you know, in many ways, this is why we're here. This is where the jobs challenge came from. Of those 3 billion, which was a 150% increase in the working age population, 63% of those were in Asia, only 19% were in Africa. Okay, so now looking forward to these 2100 projections of the UN, Asia is projected to peak here around 2040 and end up down at 2.6 billion by 2100. Africa, on the other hand, is projected to grow. So this is one of the huge changes happening in the global labor market. Asia working age population has already slowed down dramatically, is going to peak soon. Africa is going to continue growing. By 2100, they're going to be about 2.5 billion in each. Just to bring in the rest of the world, there's Latin America, and there's literally the rest of the world other than Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So for the world as a whole, the UN projects 6.1 billion people in working age population, 1 billion more than now. And you know, in round numbers, 2.5 billion in Asia, 2.5 billion in Africa, and 1 billion in everywhere else combined. Okay. The world working age population is projected to peak around 2070, 2071. So we have another interesting 50-year period to look at, 2020 to 2070. I talked about 1970 to 2020. So what does the next 50 years look like? Well, it's going to be an addition of more than 1 billion, 1.2 billion people. But of course, that compares to 3 billion that we added in the last 50 years. So it's a 25% increase, to be contrasted with the 150% increase in the past. So this need for, you know, massive numbers of jobs is slowing down, looked at from the world as a whole, but quite different regionally. So of the 1.2 billion that are going to be added in the next, in the 50 years between 2020 and 2070, Asia will account for minus 1% of them. They'll actually be a negative number. And Africa will account for more than 100%. So Africa is going to increase by more than the whole rest of the world, which will be in decline. Okay, so huge changes in what's happening here. A very noteworthy thing of this graph is that by 2040, Africa will be the only region with a growing working age population. So that's a huge change to think about just around the corner, that the rest of the world will all have declining numbers of people in the labor force and the working age population, and Africa will be the only region that is growing, and it will be growing significantly. Okay, looking at the shares, Asia has been over 50% since 1950. It's going to be in decline. There's Africa, has been only around 10% until recently. It's going to be rising dramatically, and those will be converging roughly by the end of the century. There's Latin America and the rest of the world. The rest of the world was over 30% back in 1950. It's going to be down to only about 10%. So big changes there. Okay, so in 2024, the distribution is Asia 60%, Africa 16%, and so on. Okay, This plots the year in which the working age population will begin to decline. So this has already happened in some very important places. For example, Europe and North America combined, the working age population has been in decline since 2013. China hit the peak in 2016, Thailand in 2019. In the next decade, Chile and Brazil will join. Asia as a whole is projected to decline starting in 2037 and so on. At the top, we have some African countries projected to decline just at the end of the century. For Africa as a whole, it won't be until beyond that. So Africa as a whole will still be increasing. For the world as a whole, projected to peak in 2071. Egypt is 2079. Okay, so huge variety here in when these countries are going to reach their peak. But the important point is many of them either already have or will soon. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit, and I'll try to do this quickly, about just the origins of this change, because it's like, how do we know these things? Are these just kind of wild projections that these UN Population Division people are making? Well, unlike trying to predict what economic growth is going to be in 2080, predicting what the size of the working age population is going to be in 2080 is relatively straightforward. I mean, it's not foolproof, but there's a lot of structure on this problem. So to see kind of why these aren't just wild conjectures, it's useful to go back and look at the origins of the current demographic situation, which really go back to the 1950s and 1960s when we began the population explosion. So I like to call this the fundamental theorem of demography, that populations grow because there are more births and deaths. So demography is kind of simple. There's another fundamental theorem, which is that people get 1 year older every year. These are nice rules to live by. So that actually gets you pretty far. So just to look at like birth and death rates going back to the 1950s, if we looked at the world as a whole, birth rates used to be around 3.5% of the population was added in births every year. If we go back far enough, deaths roughly offset that. So we had thousands of years of relatively no population growth. So the birth rate was high, the death rate was high. By 1950, the death rate has already dropped enough to create some population growth. The gap between these, these are called crude rates because they don't account for age structure or anything. They're literally the number of births divided by the population, the number of deaths divided by population. So the crude birth rate minus crude death rate is the crude rate of natural increase, as it's often called, and that's what it looks like. So if we go back here to 1963, we see the all-time peak in world population growth at about 2.3%. It has been declining steadily ever since. Why did it get so high? Because death rates fell. Basically, infant mortality declined, the crude death rate fell, the birth rate stayed high for a while, and then the birth rate started to decline. How do we know what's going to happen in the future? Well, this is what demographers call the demographic transition. We went from a world of high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and low death rates. In between, there was a gap when we had the high population growth that created the population explosion. We're now down to these low birth rates and low death rates. The death rate here is rising in this picture. Why is it rising? That's because of population aging. It's not because of falling life expectancy or increasing age-specific mortality. It's actually life expectancy is improving almost everywhere in the world. But the death rate goes up because of population aging. So could we ever get population growth of 2% again in the world? Well, we're not going to get it from falling death rates because death rates are already down to, this is 5 per thousand, 0.5% of the population. It's almost inconceivable they would go down lower because population aging is actually making them rise. So we're not going to get it from falling death rates. We're almost to zero already. Could we get it from rising birth rates? Well, there's nothing that says it's not possible, but it would require fertility going back way up high, back to levels we haven't seen for a generation. So that's why we can be pretty sure that we've seen the end of world population growth at the levels that we had and why it's going to continue on. Now, if we look at the picture here, We're now at a growth rate of a little under 1% for the world, and it's projected to hit 0 in 2084. So obviously you could fiddle with these and adjust that a little bit, but you know, it's very hard to develop a scenario in which the world doesn't stop growing sometime in the next 50, 60 years. If we look at Africa, there's the crude birth rate, there's the crude death rate. It's the same basic story in every country in the world. It's just a matter of degree and how big the gap got between birth rates and death rates when we went through the demographic transition. In Africa, it got bigger. It got up to about 3%. That was to Asia did the same thing. And the population growth rate has been going down since the 1980s. So current growth rate about 2.5% per year, which is you know, quite high by international standards. You can see looking forward, the crude death rate for Africa looks a lot like it did for the world, and that's because it does look a lot like it for the world. The big difference is the birth rate is still high. How fast is it going to fall? That is the big sort of source of uncertainty in all of these projections. So what happens to Africa in this decade is really about how fast fertility declines. Okay. I want to say a little bit about how we know that China is going to lose 600 million people. So that should kind of grab you as a prediction. That, as I said, is almost half of its population. Seems kind of bold, but here is sort of how to think about it. Corollary of the fundamental theorem of demography, populations grow because births exceed deaths. Populations decline because deaths exceed births, not counting international migration. So the number of deaths exceeded the number of the births in China for the first time in 2021, so it got a lot of publicity. China experiencing population decline. It has continued, and it's going to continue. How do we know that? Well, now I'm showing you not birth rates, but actual numbers of births and deaths in China from these UN estimates. They jump around. I should have mentioned before, there's the Great Famine of 1960 that shows up here and everything for China, and it's so big that it affects the whole world. And there's some fluctuations here, and those have to do with sort of changing age structure related actually to the Great Famine. So this is a combination of the birth rate and the number of women of childbearing age, so those are creating some of these cycles. But basically the number of births has been going down since the 1980s, not just the birth rate, but the actual number of births. And in fact, the number of births in 2024 is projected to be half of the number of births in 2017, from 20 million down to 10 million, roughly. What's happening to deaths? Well, deaths went down as infant mortality went down, but now it's going up. It's mostly going up because of, again, of population aging. Also has to do with the age structure working its way through from all this past population growth. So there's the number of natural increase, not the rate of natural increase, but actual number of people being added every year. So in China, so as I said, this deaths exceeded births beginning in 2023, projected to continue on for decades. So China is going to go from adding 20 million people a year in 1990 to losing 14 million people a year in 2060. And if you integrate under that curve there, you get this loss of 600 million people by 2084. So massive change in what's happening in China. But it's not just China. China, of course, is huge. It had the one-child policy, which may or may not have been responsible for the fertility decline. Many other nearby countries had similar rates of fertility decline. I just wanted to show you Brazil. There's a number of births in Brazil. They've been declining since the 1980s. Combination of falling fertility rate, age-specific birth rates, and what's happening to the age structure. There's deaths going up because of population aging. And so there's natural increase in Brazil. It's projected to reach zero population growth and population decline beginning in 2043. So in less than 10 years, the Brazilian population will actually begin to decline. It'll go from, again, from adding 2 million people a year to losing 1 million people a year. The working age population typically begins to decline sooner than the population as a whole, because the last group to stop growing is the old population. So we know about population aging, and if you do this sort of age group by age group, you know, first the number of children stops growing, then the number of young people stops growing, and eventually it works its way to the old people. So the working age population begins to decline before the total population. So we see that there. Okay. All of this is driven by what's happening to fertility rates. I'll just show you quickly this is the fertility rate that does adjust for age structure. So this is the number of births projected for a woman over her lifespan, standard measure of fertility that demographers use. So easy interpretation. So 5, you can think of as 5 births per woman. That's what the world had in 1950. Asia and Latin America sort of track out the world. Of course, Asia is kind of driving everything for most of these decades. Here's Africa by contrast. So Africa's fertility rate was not so different back in 1950. The difference is it's fallen much more slowly. And so as of 2024, Africa still has a total fertility rate of 4, average of 4 births per woman. But you can see it's been falling significantly from around 7 down to 4. Projected to continue declining. That's the big source of uncertainty. Below replacement fertility is 2.1, roughly every woman having 2 children plus some extra for girls who do not survive to reproductive age, technical detail, but roughly 2 births per woman is going to be eventually 0 population growth. The world is almost there. The world is at 2.2. Asia, Latin America, Europe are all below replacement fertility. So Africa is basically the engine of future population growth, such as it is. Okay. Just quickly on how much fertility varies around Africa. It varies a lot. So this is the time trend. Everybody was kind of similar in the 50s and 60s. Southern Africa, North Africa have had much more rapid fertility decline. They look much more like Latin America and Asia. West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa still having pretty high fertility, as you can see here. Egypt's fertility rate is 2.7, so you know, relatively low compared to much of the rest of Africa, but still you know, well above replacement. Okay, how important is uncertainty? I think I'm going to skip over this. I'm glad to come back. I'll just say the UN does do these probabilistic projections. They project a range to 95th, upper 95th, lower 95th percentile. The fertility variation out to 2050 is about 30% from the top to the bottom of these. But when you look at the working age population, it only varies by 10% because most of that working age population in 2050 is already born. So there's just a little bit of variation. Mortality doesn't tend to matter very much because there isn't much mortality even in poor countries between 15 and 64 and even between 5 and 64. Once we go beyond 2050, there's a lot more uncertainty, of course, but if we're projecting out a few decades, you know, we know a lot about the working age population. It's basically, most of it's already here. International migration often comes up when I talk about these things. I'll just say the UN projections do include international migration, so the numbers I show you for countries include the UN's estimate of international migration based on various statistics. It's just a single net migration number for the country. Is no distinction between in versus out. There's no distinction by age, gender, et cetera. So we can't just look at the working age population. But for some countries, the in-migration is quite significant. So the United States, for example, would have population decline in coming decades were it not for the estimate of international migration. So just a few highlights here. Asia is projected to have outmigration of 0.05%, so quite a low number. That's 2.3 million people a year. Africa, also quite a low number. You know, not negligible. Europe and North America are the regions that have net in-migration. That's about 0.3% per year, or about 3 million people a year. Now, and you can look at various countries there. So on the high side, Nepal has the highest out-migration of over 1% a year. Netherlands has the highest in-migration of about 0.7% per year. Okay, so, but if you accumulate these things, they start to make a difference. So those are sort of annual rates, and the UN actually projects migration rates for every year. So I did this exercise where I took, started in 2020, used their projected migration rates, and basically shut off migration versus using what they do. So what I have here is the number for Asia straight out of the UN projection numbers, and this is the number if you shut off migration as they've estimated. The main point is it's not a huge difference here in Asia. It's even a smaller difference in Africa. So Africa has quite a lot of out-migration, we might think, but at least according to these UN estimates based on everything they can sort of come up with, they don't make a huge difference. For Europe and North America, which are the main recipient organizations, of course, they're smaller populations, the numbers do start to add up quite a lot. So just to show you, by 2050, Asia and Africa only differ by 1 or 2% with and without migration, but Europe and North America vary by 16%. By 2075, that number for Europe and North America is 33%. Show you this in part because one question about how are global labor markets going to respond is, one question is, what's the possibility that migration is going to increase and be the mechanism that sort of makes everything equilibrate again? Well, you would have to increase migration a lot out of Africa to offset the huge disparities that are going to be between African population growth and population decline in the rest of the world. By 2075, as I said, population only differs by 4% with and without migration, but it's much more important in Europe and North America. So I did this exercise. What if you doubled out migration from Africa, which would still only take you from 2.6% to 5.2% of the population migrating, and you sent all those people to Europe and North America? The proportion of migrants in Europe and North America would increase from 33% to 54% of the non-migrant population. So this would be a huge shock to the labor markets in those countries, and actually fairly modest adjustment to the working age population in Africa. Okay. One of the ways to think about these numbers is how many people are being added to the working age population every year. So you're the Minister of Labor. This is how many new jobs you're going to need every year. So I'm going to do this both absolute numbers and annual growth rates. So this is just taking the number of people 15 to 64. There's no accounting for labor force participation or actual employment. This is just the working age population. And how much difference is it in 2025 to what it was in 2024? Okay, so this is what it looks like for the world as a whole. So this is in millions. So this peaked at 73 million people per year in 2005. That was a 1.8% growth rate. So the world as a whole was adding over 70 million people a year to the working age population. So in a sense, the world needed 70 million jobs, new jobs, every year to keep up with that growth of the working age population. Asia, the major driver of that, it peaked at the same year, not surprisingly, at about 50 million. So Asia was adding 50 million people a year to the working age population. Look at Africa, it looks quite different. It was much lower, but it's now just about hit the same level as Asia. Is projected to keep growing. It's projected to hit a peak at 27 million per year in 2042, or 2.1% annual growth. Okay, so that's just what it looks like in terms of like how many new jobs you need if you were going to make a job for every new entry to the working age population. Of course, not everybody participates or needs that many jobs, but it's still a good, useful benchmark. Okay, so 2020, the world was adding 47 million people a year, 23 million in Asia, 21 million in Africa. So roughly equal Asia and Africa. If we jump out to 2070, the world hits zero. So this is an interesting year because the world now adds net no new people to the working age population. But Africa has 21 million. So the rest of the world is losing 21 million. And 16 million of those are in Asia, and then the other 5 in the rest of the world. So we get to this situation in which Africa needs 20 million jobs a year. The rest of the world is losing 20 million jobs a year, so to speak, 20 million people from the working age population. Will those jobs move? What will happen? These are the things I want to throw out to you. Looking at growth rates, the world peaked at an annual growth rate of 2.4% in 79, projected to hit zero in 2070, as I've noted. Asia hit a peak of about 3% in 1979, and here's Africa, which hit a peak of 3% in 82. Now, the important thing about these numbers from an African perspective is Africa's growth rate of the working age population is not off the charts. It's about the same as it was for Asia at its peak, about 3% per year. It's just that in Asia, that only lasted for, 5 years or so. It went up real fast and it came down real fast. In Africa, it went up fast and it stayed high, and then it's projected to decline. Okay, so the peaks are similar, but this sustained level of growth is what's been the challenge in Africa. This is just the percentage increase for a whole bunch of countries for the next decade. So Africa's working age population will grow 31% in the next decade compared to 7% in Asia. A few examples from around the continent. So Niger hitting the extreme at 47% increase, down to China, which already has a decline. This shows you what happens in 2040 to 2050. The important thing here is these rates are all going down. So the percentage increase in a decade in the number of jobs needed is declining in every one of these countries and in every one of these regions. By the time you get to Latin America, Asia, and Europe, they're all declining. They're going to have job decline or working age population decline over that decade. Okay, so just some numbers. Africa needs about 2 million jobs a month to keep up with the growth of the working age population in this decade. 2040 to 50, it's going to rise to about 2.3 million per month and then start to decline a little bit. Compare that to Asia. Asia is also about 2 million a month. So Asia and China currently have kind of equal jobs challenge, you might say. They need 2 million jobs a month to keep up with the growth of the working age population. But in Asia, that's going to go negative by 2040, 50, and by 2050 to 60, they're going to be losing 1 million working age people a month in that decade. A few other countries, you can see India, Nigeria, and so on. China at the bottom, already having declines every month. It'll be 1 million a month in China in 2050 to 60 by these projections. And as I said, projecting China's working age population 2050 to 60 does not require any great assumptions. Basically, those people are mostly already born. There's not a whole lot of variability in those projections. Okay. This is just a graph that shows the annual growth of the working age population by the share. I'll show you what I mean here. So what do we see from this? You might ask, like, how many people live in a country with a declining working age population? The answer now is about 11%. So this is just the cumulative. So the countries below the zero line have declining working age population, a growth rate that's negative. Above the line, you have a growth rate that's positive. So 90% of the world lives in countries with a positive growth of working age population, but many are getting very close to zero, including China. the annual growth for the median worker, you might say. So the median working age person across these countries is about 1%. Okay, looking forward to 2050, the curve shifts down as we get all these population declines, and the percentage of the world's working age population in a country with declining working age population jumps to 50%, 55% actually, okay. So more than half the world by 2050 will live in a country with a shrinking working age population. If we look to 2075, and by 2050, the median person will be in a shrinking population of minus 0.1%. Go to 2075, the curve looks like this. It's shifting down. The percentage of countries with very high growth has gone way down. But interestingly, this share working in a country with a declining population is exactly the same, 55%, and this median is just under negative. Why isn't that going down more? Because we're basically seeing a huge shift. The countries with rapid growth are now dominating the top of the distributions. Basically, the median country is sort of moving down the distribution. So for example, here's China. There's China moving down. So China was almost like a median country now. It's going to be way down at the bottom of the distribution. So China is 18% now. By 2075, it's only going to be 7%. Nigeria is 2% now. It's going to be 5%. Okay. Now, the last point I want to make, and I'll try to move through this quickly, is that the labor force is getting older. So this should not be a surprise. The population is getting older, so the labor force has to get older. But I think for labor economists, we haven't yet kind of digested this. The era of the youth bulge is over. We're going to be in the era of the older worker bulge. So why are populations getting older? It's not because life expectancy is increasing, although it is, and that is a minor factor. It's because of the falling fertility. So the people are just coming in at the bottom at a much slower rate. So the working age population is getting older. So we tend to think of the working age population growing because it's growing from the bottom, but it's actually not going to be growing from the bottom. It's going to be growing at the top, which is kind of a little hard to get your head around, but it's the same as the whole population. So the number of babies has been going down in almost every country in the world, and yet they're still growing. They're growing at the top because it's working through what we call population momentum. So many countries currently have a growing working age population, but a shrinking number of young workers, okay? And it's because we're just working through this sort of rat in the snake, or whatever metaphor you like, sort of population momentum. Okay, so interesting new challenges for labor markets. So this is the increase in the size of working age groups. So Asia has 4% growth of its total working age population projected for the next 25 years. It has a decline in the number of 15 to 24-year-olds, a decline in the number of 25 to 30-year-olds, and so on. So the growth is very much at the top. Africa, on the other hand, has growth in every age group, with the biggest increases again at the top. Latin America looks a lot like Asia. The rest of the world has declines in every age group. And the world as a whole fits this same pattern of the whole labor force is growing, but the youth labor force is actually shrinking. So Africa is the only region with growth in this young age group. By 2050 to 75 period, to show you the whole thing, Africa is the only region with growing age groups. These others have declines in every age group. But it'll always be that the fastest growing age group is the old age group. All right, I'll go through this just real fast. This just shows the working age population by age group. And the main point here is just this shift from being very dominated by young to being almost equally distributed by the end. I'll just skip through that. This is the annual additions by age group. And again, currently the big additions are at the bottom with the young people. but that's going to change, and the big increases are going to be with the older workers. And we can think about, you know, if we follow a cohort, there's the largest cohort ever born in Africa, born in 2001 to 2010, 10-year cohort, and there they are working their way through. So where do these old workers suddenly show up? You know, you're in charge of providing jobs for 50 to 59-year-olds. That's you got that desk at the labor ministry. Suddenly, like, that number is going up a lot. Like, where are these people coming from? Where are these cohorts that were born, you know, 50 years ago, finally showing up? And meanwhile, the person in charge of 15 to 24-year-olds has, like, declining numbers every year, even in Africa. Okay. I won't mention these other things. You know, other things are happening. There's lots of things we could think about. They're becoming more urban, becoming more educated. I'll skip over that. You all know that. So the job creation challenge, going to add 1 billion people to the working age, 80% of them in Africa. Africa's working age population more than double in the next 25 years. The number of young workers is falling in Asia and Latin America, but it's going to increase in Africa. This shift to the older worker bulge is the other big dramatic change I want to mention. So we've been totally focused on making jobs for young people entering the labor force. That challenge, in a sense, becomes much less going forward. Those numbers are actually going to decline. They're already declining in most of the world and will eventually even be declining in Africa. Africa and Asia currently need about 2 million jobs a month. That's going to go up in Africa. It's going to go negative in Asia. So what will be the impact of all this? Of Africa being the only region with a growing working age population. So we're leaving a period in which at a conference like this, we were thinking every country in the world needs more jobs, have a growing working age population. That era is ending. Most of the world is going to have a shrinking working age population. The exception, important exception being Africa. Most countries will actually need fewer jobs than they have had in the past. So the question is, will jobs move from Asia to Africa? Will people move from Africa to Asia? I throw this out to you in the coming 2 days. By 2070, the world as a whole will have no growth in the working age population, but Africa will have 21 million new people. The rest of the world will lose 21 billion people in that year from a working age population. So will those 21 million jobs somehow end up in Africa? So these are the questions I throw out to you. Are people going to move? Is capital going to move? Will somehow economic growth in Africa be enhanced by the fact that the rest of the world has a shrinking working age population? So thank you very much. Yeah, are we taking questions or happy to answer any questions?
Arguably is substantially easier to steer as a government. So obviously they have to make assumptions to make these projections, but I feel like if governments like China or South Korea were to seriously take this threat of population decline, they might well engage in like very radical migration policies to offset that, which is this type of uncertainty that's very hard to capture in these kind of projections?
Yeah, very good question. So yeah, how might policy respond both in migration, where you might expect big changes? Because I think a lot of these countries have actually not completely absorbed what's happening. And how are they going to respond? So they may allow more migration, that's very possible. In the case of Asian countries, almost all the other countries are also going to be in decline, but at different rates. On fertility, you know, a lot of countries are trying to increase their fertility. That's very hard, very few examples of policies that actually work there. Of course, there's a question of, you know, will fertility fall faster in Africa? That's very possible. I actually think it may, but, you know, those are kind of tweaks at the margin, and they, you know, changing fertility in Africa would only, you know, affect things decades out and probably wouldn't change the curves a lot. But this is obviously the question, you know, are people going to respond in, especially in policy toward international migration, where, you know, I think China losing half of its population, I mean, that's kind of a huge shock. Yes?
Any more questions? Thank you.
David, thanks for this. I'm Jeff Johnson. I'm with the ILO. I've done a lot of work over the years on these numbers as well. I'm curious to get your reaction. I know you picked 15 to 64, but normally we, the ILO, would have done 25 to 64. The reason I raised the question is economies develop, younger people have a tendency to actually stay in education longer. And so I think that would have an effect on the numbers. I'm just curious if you have looked at that. Likewise, we're seeing a movement in OECD countries to raise retirement age to around 67 or even 70. So we're creating a different dynamic when it comes to the labor force participation. The second real question is, when you look at just the simple numbers, you can see the demographics going through. But the question that we often also look at is the labor force participation rates by the different cohorts, male, female, et cetera. Right. Because I think this is going to affect a lot of the numbers as we move forward. But you're absolutely right. What the future of work is going to look like 15, 20 years from now could be dramatically different. There may be no need for migration. Certain jobs can do online services. We're going to see a lot of shifts in that regards. Right. I'm less worried about China. I've worked a lot in China about the numbers. And no, I don't think in China they're looking at a policy of migration per se. They're looking at replacement. They're looking at extending the retirement age. So back to my question though, I'm just wondering if you've looked at these numbers in terms of honing in on the 25 to 64 or 55 plus, and then looking at the upper bounds and seeing what that would do in terms of labor force participation rates, because these are shifting. No, great presentation, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I've always thought the 15 to 24 maybe should not be included. Should probably just do it both ways. But what's happening on the upper end, as you say, is very important because that's where the growth is. So if you extended it to 70 instead of 65, that's going to add a lot of people to the working age going forward. Although there's very high growth there, those numbers are still relatively small. That's still kind of the small part of the age structure now, though it's going to be growing a lot. And then, of course, another policy, not exactly policy, but was something people might try to influence, is participation rate. So this just, did the working age population. If you had a huge increase in the labor force participation of women in countries where it's not that high, you would offset a lot of this working age population decline. And then, of course, you have robots and AI and so on that I didn't have time to get into that may mean that these countries, like European countries and Japan and China, they just make up for the loss of these working age by automating, which means, in some sense, the jobs aren't going to go to Africa because they're going to go to robots.
We
Gary?
can have one more question.
Okay,
Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, David. I wanted to ask something about a point you raised that was brand new to me. I had never heard the term older worker bulge before. And so
that's good. I made it up. I was hoping it might.
Well, it's good. It was evocative. But my question is, so recognizing that there will be this bulge of about 20 million workers in some parts of the world, what thoughts do you have about what should be done to make the labor market, help the labor market accommodate this aging workforce?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, I should just say a little bit about, what does it mean to be adding 20 million workers age 55 to 64 or something, they're obviously already there. So it's just that they're aging in. But literally what it means is that the number of 55 to 64-year-old workers in 1 year is 20 million more than it was the year before. And so, if you give those people jobs when they're 15 or 24 or whenever they enter the labor force, and they keep those jobs for their whole life, then everything's fine. But presumably that's a huge change to go from, gradually smaller number of workers in every age group to growing numbers of workers in every age group, because there really is the challenge of you're not necessarily having to make a new job for an old worker, but suddenly, you've got this big increase in the number of older workers, and the labor force may just not be set up to that. I mean, you may be set up, there's this many people, young people in jobs, there's this many old people in jobs, we've had this sort of pyramidal structure, and suddenly, there's more old workers than there are young workers. That's a big adjustment, and some jobs may work for that and some not. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor David, for these insightful and critical insights on how demographics will shape the coming 60 years of the world of work. We're very happy to start now a very short break. Please head outside, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Kindly take your seats. Thank you all for coming back. Let me welcome Federica Saliola. They will give us new insights on the new policy framework at the World Bank, more on growth and jobs agenda.
No. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our plenary session on economic growth and jobs agenda, a new policy framework. Today, we will present to you a novel framework, actually a new policy organizing framework for job strategies that we've been developing over the past years at the bank and discussing with you, that redefines how we think about jobs, how we think about policy priorities, how the policy come together, how they evolve together. Now, we heard this morning from Professor Lam and the opening remarks that we all know that the jobs challenge remain one of the most pressing issues in developing countries. We heard about how much the world is grappling and will have to grapple with demographic shifts. We have technology advancement. Now we have, the climate change. They're all reshaping labor market, adding to already very complex agenda. As we know, the jobs agenda is multi-sectoral, multi-policy. So it's really hard. There are no jobs policies, but there are job strategies. So we hope that this novel framework will help us think through these job strategies and how I can prioritize policies. Now, the MENA region is no exception. There are a lot of challenges in the region. There is huge potential. So today, we focus the discussion on the Middle East and North Africa region. We're fortunate, we have a very distinguished panel that will introduce you after the presentation of the framework. Unfortunately, Manuela Francisco, who was supposed to be here and present to you this framework, had an unforeseen commitment. So she can be here, but she recorded the presentation. Manuela Francisco is our Global Director for Economic Policy in the Prosperity Network of the World Bank Group. So let me start with Manuela's presentation, and then I'll invite afterwards the panelists to join us for a discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the plenary session on the Economic Growth and Jobs Agenda. I'm Manuela Francisco, Global Director for the Economic Policy Department at the World Bank. I would have loved to be with you in Cairo today, but unfortunately I was not able to travel. I'm glad, though, that I'm able to deliver these remarks to you ahead of what I'm sure will be an excellent discussion with my colleagues. The need to create more and better jobs in developing countries is urgent. In the next 10 years, 1.2 billion young people in the Global South will reach working age. Of these, more than 700 million will have completed their education. Yet, under the current trajectory, 4 out of 10 of these young people, mostly young women, will not have a job. In the Middle East and North Africa, that figure is almost 6 out of 10. And because those entering the labor market will have higher levels of education and higher expectations, they will be looking for good jobs, those that are more productive and offer better pay. Out of those who do have a job, the majority will be in the informal sector with volatile and often low incomes. So, if we don't act immediately, millions of young individuals could be left without opportunities, which could have important consequences. To help address this challenge, the World Bank is redoubling its efforts to support countries in creating more and better jobs that match the educational achievements of these young people, enabling them to realize their potential and contribute positively to society. I want to emphasize that central to World Bank's approach to jobs is the creation of not just more, but better jobs, where workers can be more productive, earn more, and escape poverty. Income from one's jobs is the single most important driver of poverty reduction. Yet, people in poor countries earn very little from their work, leading to high poverty rates. More than 40% of people in low-income countries live on less than $2.50 per day. So the jobs agenda must focus on creating jobs that allow workers to earn enough to escape poverty, but also focus on building resilience against climate and other shocks. The first point I would like to highlight is that most low-income countries face a critical shortage of good jobs, not a general lack of employment. As you can see in the left-hand side chart, the share of adults in low-income countries who are employed is only slightly lower than their share in high-income countries. Unemployment rates are similar across income groups. But the right-hand side chart shows that only 18% of workers in low-income countries hold wage jobs compared with 88% in high-income countries. Not working is not an option for most people in low-income countries. That's why they become self-employed or have informal jobs with low productivity and low wages. Those are called jobs of necessity. The primary challenge in low-income countries is therefore not employment or the scarcity of jobs per se, but rather a scarcity of productive jobs capable of keeping families firmly out of poverty. Not all good jobs are wage jobs, but they are a reasonable proxy based on the data we have. Wage jobs are offered by firms where workers can leverage technology, machinery, and organization for higher productivity and better pay. There is a strong correlation between high labor productivity and high share of wage jobs, as you can see on the left panel. On the other hand, the other chart shows that jobs of necessity are concentrated in agriculture, and that economies with high agriculture employment relative to total employment tend to have lower productivity. Over the last 2 decades, many developing countries have seen an increase in the share of people between 15 and 34 years old who are not in employment, education, or training, despite improvements in educational attainment. Although education levels have increased, youth often continue to face limited employment opportunities, which leads them to either withdraw from the labor market or migrate to other countries in search of better opportunities. Another aspect I would like to emphasize is that, despite progress in women's education, gender gaps persist in labor markets. Globally, 1.4 billion women are not working for income or actively seeking a job. While male employment rates remain stable across income levels, female rates decline significantly at medium income levels, as we can see in the right-hand side chart. There are great opportunities in leverage women's talent in the labor market, with estimates of significant gains in economic activity as well as higher investment in human capital of children. This slide used the example of India to depict the number of jobs on the x-axis and the average wage that people earn from those jobs. It's very simplified, but it captures the 3 shifts we think jobs policies need to focus on. First, create more good jobs to make this area to the left larger. Second, increase productivity of all jobs, both good jobs and the jobs of necessity. That means higher incomes for all workers, which would be reflected by shifting the horizontal line up. Third, include some of those on the right who are not in the labor market, especially women. As you can see, these 3 shifts increase the shaded area, which is the overall labor income in these countries. We think that increasing labor incomes are a helpful summary of these 3 pillars of jobs policy. So, how do we create more and better jobs? Creating more good jobs will require removing barriers that prevent productive firms from expanding and hiring, and reducing frictions that prevent workers from finding a job that is a good fit. It will also require improving the productivity of subsistence jobs and remove the barriers faced by women and youth to find jobs. Creating more and better jobs requires a multidimensional approach that prioritizes policies based on complementarity, long-term foundations, and inclusivity. Strong macroeconomic policies and well-functioning markets for capital, labor, and land are a critical foundation. You will not see strong job creation in a country with a large parallel market for foreign exchange and significant imbalance that raise uncertainties and costs for business. These are the foundations. Production policies should address labor demand constraints by removing barriers to private sector growth and productivity. This includes improving market access, reducing regulatory hurdles, promoting competition, ensuring property rights, and expanding access to finance. People policies should target labor supply constraints by investing in skills and human capital. This involves providing strong foundational skills in childhood, improving access to quality education at all levels, and supporting lifelong learning. Active labor market programs, such as employment service, training, and self-employment support, are also useful and should be integrated into government systems for scalability. Places policies include infrastructure improvements, and security are needed to facilitate worker mobility and reduce the cost of rural-urban migration and enable firms to connect to markets. As I mentioned, millions of young women and men are entering their working years with more education than ever. We must act immediately if we want them to find good jobs that match their aspirations so that they can realize their potential. With this, let me thank you and wish you all a good conference.
Well, we're fortunate to have a very now distinguished panel who will share their insights and discuss how this new framework can be applied to the Middle East and North Africa region. The speakers bring a wealth of expertise from various fields. So let me first invite His Excellency, Dr. Hamed Galal, to join us on stage. Dr. Galal is the chairman of the Middle East and North Africa Health Policy Forum and former Egypt's finance minister. He previously served as managing director of the Economic Research Forum and worked at the World Bank for 18 years. While on leave from the bank, he also led the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. Dr. Galal has authored over a dozen books and was awarded the Kuwait Foundation's Regional Prize for Economic and Social Sciences in 2004. Welcome, Dr. Galal. Then let me invite Dr. Nadir Mohamed, who is the World Bank Regional Director for Prosperity in the Middle East and North Africa region. Nadir joined the bank in 1998 as a country economist, and he has since then held key roles, including country manager for Albania, operations director for the Middle East and North Africa region, and senior advisor in the PREM network. He also served as acting director of strategy for Kuwait's Prime Minister Office. Welcome. And then let me also welcome Dr. Federico Giazzander, who is the practice manager of the Global Macroeconomic and Debt Unit at the World Bank Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice. He previously served as lead country economist for Angola, DRC, Burundi, Sao Tome and Principe, and earlier for Indonesia, India, and Malaysia. He joined the bank in 2006, and he worked on debt relief, management, sustainability. Welcome, Federico. And then, last but not least, with immense thanks, given the time difference, we have Professor Raghi Assad, who is connecting from Minnesota, so it's very early for him. It's very late, yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's not a comfortable, let's say, time for him, so we appreciate the effort. Professor Raghi Assad is the free chair in international economic policy at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He's also a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo and the Center for Labor Economics, the ISA in Bonn. I think it doesn't need an introduction. His research focuses on MENA, labor markets, and human development, with an emphasis on youth, gender, education, school-to-work transition, labor participation, job creation, poverty, informality, migration, and family formation. So thank you so much and welcome, Professor Assad. Okay, with that, I'll pose a few questions to our panelists, and then we'll have also 10-15 minutes at the end for questions, for Q&A with the audience. So let me start with Nadir. So you heard from Manuela Francisco, this new policy organizing framework we've been developing with 3 Ps: production, people, and places. So the question is how you envision this 3P framework being operationalized in the Middle East and North Africa region, like what specific tension or challenges may arise during the implementation, and where you also see the greatest potential for impact. Over to you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. It's really great pleasure to be with you, and I would like to extend also appreciation to the partners who've been organizing this important conference over the years. It's also a great opportunity to be with friends and distinguished colleagues like Professor Jalal and Professor Azad. It's been a long time not connecting with them. I speak on Middle East and North Africa, and for us in the bank, just to explain it, because it was following Professor Lam in the morning, I still have the figures in my head. For us, it's the Arab world plus minus. Actually, we add Iran and we take out Sudan, Comoros, Somalia, and Mauritania. So it's an equivalent or closer to the Arab world. And the challenges of the conference are really very relevant. Although your presentation focused on Africa and it's unique, I would emphasize that the challenges of jobs are much more complicated or pronounced in Middle East and North Africa. Briefly to respond to your question, I think the framework is useful. For me, the focus has always been in most of the policies on only one aspect of it, so bringing the 3 dimensions is extremely useful. And I would actually emphasize I think putting emphasis on labor demand upfront is really critical. Why in MENA region? Because like the theme of your conference is growth and jobs. Growth has been anemic in Middle East and North Africa region. And if you take last 2 decades, say from 2000 to 2020, GDP per capita growth is around 1.7%. All other regions have done much better, and it's actually in the fast-growing emerging markets is actually twice, or in some fast-growing emerging market is 3 times. And if you decompose it in much more details, you will find actually most of this growth has actually happened from countries that are rich in hydrocarbon, and those, by definition, their ability to generate jobs is not like if the economic structure is different. So why growth is anemic and how we can really help to speed growth, because that's ultimately how we are going to create jobs and better jobs. And you know very well the situation in the Middle East and North Africa. It's faced a lot of challenges, not only the focus these days on security and conflict, but I think there are considerable barriers to private initiative taking place. The heavy role of the state, I would emphasize, it has been common theme in all MENA countries, being rich, resource-rich countries where you have the dominance of the major oil companies and public sector. 2, I think because of history, tradition, culture, and we still have a very heavy role of the state. So all of issues about injecting competition and barriers to private sector remain very important. That's how ultimately we're gonna make progress on the job agenda. I think on the labor supply is also the region, and I have to say this with Professor Raqi and Dr. Jalal, they know more on labor markets in the region. For me, it's probably the most inflexible. And we have also a lot of work to do to ensure that injecting much more flexibility in the labor market will be. We have the challenges of the skill mismatch. But part of the region is, let me take an example. Like if you have a country like Saudi Arabia where millions of foreign workers come, still they have unemployment for their nationals at levels that are really quite high. So it's a reflection of structural nature of the, so issues of the education sector, the skills remain very important. I like briefly also the emphasis on the places because this is the one aspect of the framework that I think we haven't really focused on it. And I think it became clear from the morning keynote speech that, that there is important implications for migration. And, but even within countries, how we can really ensure that we are connecting supply and demand, issues of digital transformation, improving infrastructure, improving public transport to connect, it's something really very important. Finally, the region has a very unique, we have an outlier on many of the issues that highlighted in the morning. The lowest female labor force participation rate. It's actually in some countries like Jordan or Morocco, we speak about 15 to 19%. So it's very unique to MENA region. The youth was also emphasized. I think, and if you put the two, it's just tell you that we have a significant portion of the labor force, or our ability to be inclusive can provide huge potential, and it's not happening. We have done some work about informality. Again, the region informality level are very high. It ranges from 40 to 70%. And that's really, our position on the informal sector. It creates jobs. So there's nothing wrong with it, but it's suboptimal for the economy and for the people who are working in that sector. So I find the framework is very useful. If time permitting, I could come back and talk about where successful transformation has happened, even within these daunting challenges of the Middle East and North Africa region.
No, thank you. And we'll definitely take upon that offer to walk us through successful examples. Thank you also for talking about the complexity, like of the agenda. As I say, this region is no exception. Overall, the jobs agenda is complex, but especially like there is a combination of many factors in the region. But also you highlighted the role of the state, like it's you know, an important role as an enabler, but could also be an obstacle like for the private sector development, SOEs, which leads me to the question for Your Excellency, Dr. Galal, which is based on your experience as Egypt finance minister. If we would appreciate your views also on the framework, you think overall what value will bring to tackling the jobs challenge, but also if you can think about the fiscal trade-offs, right? As we know, we would like to do so many things, but then we need to face reality and there are fiscal constraints. So what fiscal trade-offs you anticipate when implementing the job creation strategy in the Middle East and North Africa region too? Thank you.
We seem to only have one working microphone. I'm not sure whether it's deliberate or something else. Thank you, Federica, for being here, for the question you posed, for the nice introduction, and good morning, everyone. Talking about the framework we have just heard, let me start off by being very positive, because I'm not planning to continue to be positive all the way. So let me start with the good news. The good news is that finally the World Bank is coming to terms with the idea of linking growth and jobs, not just growth. We have heard so much about the so-called jobless growth. Too many times, too many people, too many missions, too many governments for that matter, tend to take growth, growth, growth as if that's going to solve all our problems automatically. It didn't happen, and I am delighted to see the World Bank coming to terms with this idea, with this link between the two. I also want to say something that probably doesn't receive as much attention as it probably should, which is the issue of growth and distribution. It's one thing to talk about economic growth and highlight it, and we have numbers for it, and we brag about it when the region is doing 7% and when a country is growing like mad. The trouble is basically who is getting the goodies. You get a lot of fruits, but they are going only in Federica's pocket. I am sitting here poor like you see me. Well, that's not fair. So the idea of linking growth, jobs, and equality, I think, is really something that is critical and important, and I am delighted that you're getting closer to that. So that's one point. The second point that I want to make is that it's very hard to disagree with what Manuela has just told us, which is better jobs are important, good paying jobs are important. It's not just about any job, it's really the quality of jobs. So I think, and also the other side of the story, which is if you want to have these good jobs, you need to have other things happening to be able to provide these good jobs. So it's very hard to disagree with that. And then finally, on that positive list of things, it's also very difficult to disagree with the framework. When someone tells you it's production, it's people, and it's places, that's fantastic. Production is, it's how where everything happens, right? So there is an agriculture, industry, services, what have you. And what goes on in that box is what determines everything else. So that's important. But of course, production is not good enough because people have to be able to benefit or to participate in this production process in a useful way. And then finally, the supply and demand meet somewhere. The production is the demand side, whether it's growth or productivity. The skills, education, training is the supply side. And then when the two meet, they meet somewhere in a place. So it's literally the old story about supply and demand and the labor market. Now, we come to the last point that I want to make about this one, which is this PPP. PPP has a negative connotation in my book. We have heard, all of us, about the public-private partnership, and I have not seen a public-private partnership that worked. I used to be in the Ministry of Finance when we had a unit called the Public-Private Partnership Unit. And the idea was that the government was going to team with the private sector and they are going to do fantastic transactions that are going to improve the world. Well, when I got there, I had a meeting with the group that's doing that. And out of the X number of transactions that they have made, something like 80% were disputed in courts, in arbitration courts in Washington. And the liabilities on the government were enormously high. Basically, I want to convey the message that the public-private partnership is fictitious. It's actually, it sounds good, but it really isn't. And I would argue that the calling of the framework, the PPP, is not doing the framework a favor. So give it up. So that's my first part of the story. Let me move on to another part, which has to do with the so-called trade-off in fiscal policies when it comes to jobs. It is really true that you can hire everybody in government in the short run using your fiscal expansionary policy, and that comes across as if you solved the employment problem, but of course you pay a very high price for doing that. That is easy. That is easy to dismiss, right? But let me make it a little more complicated. How much time do I have? Depends on your appetite. I can. All right. Well, people always tell you there is always a trade-off, and it's not always true. And rather than theorizing, let me give you an example from an experience that I have gone through myself when I was in government in 2013. The economy was sluggish, unemployment was high, everybody was on the street, if you guys remember that time, as some of you who were around, and the demands were so stressing for creating jobs. The government was strapped for resources, didn't have a lot of resources, big fiscal deficit, in fact, big public debt as well, and you are squeezed. It's not a nice position to be in. So what do? That's where you get your trade-off between the political pressure, between the state of the economy, which is sluggish, and at the same time, you want not to misbehave and create problems for subsequent ministers of finance. I opted for the so-called expansionary fiscal policy, and it was deliberate, and that is why the IMF was not welcomed at the time. Why? And it was actually 2 rounds of fiscal stimuluses, and both of them were meant to activate the economy so that people are not complaining much and some people will find some jobs, but at the same time making sure that you're not crowding out the private sector down the road. So the stimulus package was, most of it went to infrastructure and public investment, not to current expenditure. It was deliberate. The big trick was finding resources to do that. And in that particular instance, we were lucky enough to get some support from the Gulf. We were lucky enough to have a deposit in the central bank that was never used before by the Ministry of Finance. So we were able to do that, these stimulus packages without printing money. So we didn't create the inflationary pressure that would have happened otherwise. I guess I'm trying to tell that story because it is one instance where you balance the short-run objectives with the long-run objectives of crowding in private sector and growth down the road, and solve your political problem. Otherwise, I would have lasted only for a week, and I didn't want to do that. Maybe I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. You pointed to so many key aspects when we think about the jobs agenda. This one about short-term and long-term is a very important one, because the short-term and long-term needs to work together. Very often, instead, one undermines the other, right? But you also, thank you for your supporting words at the beginning, especially on the economic growth and jobs. Like, that has pros and cons to be linked together, but it is very important because without economic growth, we can create the more and better jobs that we aim to have. So then I will ask Federico the difficult question about the connection between economic growth and jobs, and whether it is sufficient to have economic growth or not, right? Because that's a question that once we start to link the two agenda, we get asked very often. So I'll ask my colleague Federico to share his views with us, and also, if you have concrete country example that you would like to share, I think would be also very helpful. And I understand you have a few slides.
I have 2 slides, but I think I'll use just one, actually.
It's
you
one?
can put the second slide. Next one. Yes. So I think that, thank you very much, Federica, and the very interesting discussions. Thinking about, the issue of growth and jobs, I think that growth is certainly a necessary condition for jobs. And you asked me to think, what were some of the countries where you actually had growth and jobs? And I think that you can find places where you had growth and the lack of creation of good jobs, but the place where you've had the creation of good jobs, you also had growth. And I worked in East Asia at the beginning of my career. And I think that you get to see in East Asia that the economic growth, for the most part, not in a complete way, but actually did lead to the creation of good jobs. And I think that here we contrast the examples of India and the Philippines, where you can see that I think that what people talk about jobless growth in India, right? So India has experienced very high growth in the past 15 or 20 years. But as you can see, the share of good jobs in the economy is less than 20%. I asked my colleagues to create these charts for Uganda or Bangladesh even, which is a neighbor, and they all have a higher share of good jobs than India does. And what you see instead is that you have a lot of people, mostly women, who are out of the labor force. And when I worked in India, I was kind of very interested by the research of my colleagues, Martin Rama and Rinku Murgai, where they argued that, yes, there are labor norms, there are kind of supply-side issues of why women don't join the labor market in India, but it's also because, and they argued in their paper, that when you have these gender norms, that jobs are prioritized for men, the lack of good jobs means that women stay at home. So actually, if India could create more good jobs, you would see more women actually joining the labor market, or at least that was the argument in their paper. And I think that you can see some of that in this chart, that India actually is a country that has created very few good jobs. And on my left, we have the situation in the Philippines. Philippines, far from being the star performance in Southeast Asia, people joke that it's the Latin American country of Southeast Asia, but the Philippines actually, maybe because of the neighborhood effect, did actually manage to grow and create a relatively large share of these good jobs that are created by firms and that actually pay relatively higher wages and provide higher incomes to the workers that, as Manuela said, allows them to exit poverty. So what was it about the growth in East Asia based on my short experience there and thinking about also the framework, the production people places framework? So maybe we'll start with people. I think that Southeast Asia and East Asia in general, starting with Japan and then Korea and then China and then Southeast Asia, there was an investment in human capital. There was an investment in education, something that actually came from even before these countries really started to pick up, when the growth started to pick up. So there was a reservoir of people with at least a basic education. Literacy rates were high relative to some other parts of the world. So there was that reservoir of relatively educated workers. In terms of places, these were, there was a lot of investment on infrastructure that came side by side with some of the production policies. So to connect the workers with the jobs and to connect the firms with markets. And I think that here you have to go back to the story of how the export-led model actually led to competition, or at least forcing some of these countries to compete internationally. Right? So one cannot say that it was a free market, laissez-faire policy in Korea, for example. There was a lot of the chaebols in Japan before that. You have a lot of industrial policy that protected certain sectors in Southeast Asia. But there was a discipline that was given by the international markets. And if those firms, as supported as they may have been, did not manage to actually export, there was something which I'm still left to figure out, and maybe some of my colleagues have a good idea, that disciplined them and actually helped them become more productive. And in becoming more productive, they actually had to hire workers. They benefited from the initial pool of well-educated workers, but then they also trained the workers, and the workers learned on the job, and the workers learned from working with the advanced machinery that was required for these firms to be competitive internationally. So I think that East Asia offers a model. The question, I think, for us, and what creates challenges going forward, that even though we do have fewer jobs that need to be created, we also have a global trade environment that provides much fewer opportunities for countries that want to emulate this model of creating the competition driven by international markets. But the global economy is also a lot bigger, so I think that we should not give up completely on international trade just yet. And similarly, I think that the automation and AI threatens to automate some of the work that is out there and that helped absorb a lot of these workers in East Asia. But I think that, especially with services, I think that we have much more opportunities to export services than ever before. And certain services will always be very difficult to automate or to completely replace with machines. I mean, I certainly enjoy human contact, and I think that's part of the human experience, that many services that we have actually benefit from people. So I think that we need to think differently about jobs. But at the same time, I think that some of the lessons from East Asia are still useful. So with that, thank you, Federica.
Thank you. These are very useful examples indeed, and you hinted to the social norms at the beginning of your intervention. Maybe if we can, I would like to give the floor to Professor Assad, if we can. Okay.
Sure, I'm here.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Federica. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear, very well. So,
Great.
Federico was talking about social norms, and we talk a lot about demographics today, Raghi. So, women and youth, as we know, remain a big challenge in the Middle East and North Africa region. So do you believe this 3P will take on the suggestion to change the acronym? For now, let's call it this production, people, places, new framework. Do you think will help us leverage the untapped potential that is in the region, especially for those two demographic groups? And, otherwise, what adjustment or consideration you think should be made to ensure that the framework will actually benefit youth and women, given, again, the challenges that the region experiences? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to join you in person for this conference. I'm clearly missing out on all the wonderful interactions you're having, and I hope I can be coherent at 3 o'clock in the morning. But so first, let me talk about youth. David Lamb just told us that the youth population is declining in most of the world, so there's no need to worry about youth employment. I say not so fast. Remember, there was this youth bulge generation, which is now no longer youth. They are in their early 40s in many countries, and maybe mid-40s. But each of them is having about an average of 3 children in some countries, like Egypt, for example. And so there is a big echo that's following this youth bulge. I call it the echo generation. And this is a large group of young people who are going to start entering the labor market this decade, starting in 2025 for about 10 years. So the demographic pressure on the labor market with youth are continuing with us, despite what David Lamb just told us about that. But I want to focus on one of the most important messages of the Jobs for Development report, which was not really discussed by Manuela, which was that the transformations that are related to the structural changes that are related to increased productivity, these transformations mostly occur at the margins, with the new generations of labor market entrants experiencing these transformations at much greater rates than the average worker. The report talks about sector reallocation from agriculture to non-agriculture, spatial reallocation from rural to urban areas, occupational shifts towards more skilled occupations, and also the organizational shifts from self-employment to wage employment and more complex work organizations. Now, all of these changes are primarily experienced by young new entrants to the labor market. Most existing workers probably will not change very much along these dimensions, but the new entrants are the ones that are really trying to capture opportunities along these new dimensions. So this has tremendous implications for how we prepare and support youth in negotiating these changes. So, for example, recent research in Egypt has shown that the fastest growing jobs in Egypt currently are what are called green jobs, and jobs in the ICT sector, and also ICT jobs outside that industry. So these may not be starting for a very large base, but they are growing at 3 to 4 times faster than average employment. And this suggests that young people need to be increasingly prepared to engage in these kinds of occupations. Now, Manuela did talk about the fact that the young people are much more educated, and that education doesn't only come with increased productivity, but it also comes with increased expectations and aspirations for good jobs and for making these modern transitions into the labor market, into good jobs. In the past, they just used to transition into their family farm or their small family business or into casual employment. Now they're expecting these good jobs. And if they don't get them, if they fail these modern transitions, then they get very frustrated and very discouraged. And the waiting for these good jobs often shows up in the form of higher unemployment, long unemployment durations, higher NEET rates, this not in employment, education, or training rates. And so we often see that as a really serious problem. But in fact, it is because of the higher aspirations for obtaining good jobs that young people are willing to wait longer to enter the labor market. And so I think the 3P framework does help shape the policies that support young people in achieving these successful modern transitions to good jobs. First, clearly, there is the policies for people and doing better jobs, preparing students for the job market by providing with relevant skills and competences rather than just credentials. That's clearly obvious, but the policies for production are essential. And because the growing demand for labor in sectors that produce good quality, high productivity jobs in sophisticated, well-managed workplaces is really essential. And so let me take, for instance, I'll take a little bit of a quibble with Ahmed Galal's when he said that they spent a lot of money on infrastructure and public investment. Most of that went into construction, into real estate. In fact, those sectors produce really bad jobs. They're temporary, they're casual, they're informal, and they're accessible only by a very small group of people. And educated young people, especially women, cannot access these jobs. So I think it matters where the investment goes and what kind of policy framework one takes. Now, third, policies for places will allow youth to easily access labor markets in high productivity urban environments by facilitating access to affordable housing, good public transportation, and good labor market information, all of which are really important for them to be able to access good jobs. Now, what about the relevance for women? And I think that clearly here there was this important chart that Manuela showed us, which showed this very important empirical regularity, which is the U-shaped curve of female labor force participation with respect to income per capita. That in the middle of the distribution, labor force participation is lowest. And this is because the transformation that is occurring, that the four transformations that we talked about, in particular transformation from agriculture to non-agriculture, results in a situation in which people move from working for family-based organizations that are very closely connected to their home life and into work outside the home in the public space. And that transition is often very hard for women. And so women, as that transformation occurs, in the middle of the income distribution, tend to prefer to stay at home rather than negotiate that difficult transition into the public space. And it's only later that when institutions are there to support women's reproductive roles by providing things like childcare and providing other care services, that women are able to move into these more marketized, more specialized kinds of jobs. So in fact, the U-shaped curve is quite exaggerated in our region because many of the countries in the middle of that income distribution are from MENA and South Asia, and they tend to have very low participation rates. Now, how does the 3P framework is relevant to this? Well, clearly, we want to accelerate the transition to the higher part of the U, where after we have that decline in participation, we want to move into that more specialized, marketized type of employment. And we've been very successful for women on the aspects of preparing people in the terms of education. Women's education has gone up tremendously in the MENA region. They have the gender gap in education has almost closed. In fact, it has reversed in many countries. Of course, there is a need for greater this education to be more relevant to the market and for what is needed in the labor market. But there's been a great amount of progress done. But we have what's called the MENA paradox, which is the fact that despite this growing education among women, and despite the fact that in the past employment and participation had been strongly linked to education, we don't see an increase in female labor force participation. And in fact, we see women increasingly leaving the labor market after being educated. So what are the barriers that are preventing women from accessing the labor market? I totally agree that one of the main barriers is the lack of good jobs. When good jobs are not available, women in the region, because of the social norms around the female and the gender division of labor in the household, the male breadwinner, the female homemaker, they're not obliged to go get a bad job. So they'd rather stay home rather than take up a bad job, which is what the men are forced to do. So there is this fallback position, which is not entering the labor market when no good jobs are available. But there are also social norms that basically relating to women's modesty and social norms relating to the gender division of labor that I just mentioned that are creating these barriers. So what can the 3P framework do? Well, clearly, there is the places policies can do a much better job in creating safer public spaces, safer workplaces. And these are the lack of security in these spaces is what creates the kind of the reputational and sexual and reputational safety risks that women have in the public space. And so if the policies are able to improve the accessibility and better enforce sexual harassment laws and other to make these spaces safer, I think that will be an extremely important step in allowing women to go into those public spaces. The norms about the sexual division of labor really are quite dominant in the region, and unless we provide ways of allowing women to balance their reproductive roles and their roles in the home with their ability to be productive in the workplace, and that's always going to be a huge double burden on women because of the lopsided load of unpaid care work that they have to carry. And so policies with regard to childcare, with regard to the care economy in general, are really important in order to shift some of those unpaid care work responsibilities to the marketplace and allow women to be able to move into jobs.
Thank you.
I say there are triple dividends to care economy investments. First, there is the fact that you displace this unpaid care work that women have to do. The second is that you provide jobs for women. The care economy is one of the largest places in which women are able to be employed outside the home. And then third, you invest in the next generation in terms of education, childcare, and early childhood development. So I think that there is definitely a great deal of policy focus on the care economy and growing that is important.
Thank you.
So I think that as a result, the 3P framework is of great relevance for enhancing the ability of women and youth to participate in productive employment and earn incomes. And because women and youth are at the forefront of these transformations that are critical to these good jobs materializing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Raghi. We miss you here. I'm sure people would have a lot of follow-up questions for you. So we're running out of time, but I promise we would open for Q&A. Maybe we have time for 1-2 quick questions instead of me asking my follow-up questions. So are there any? So 1, and then anybody else? And 2? Okay. Do we have mic? 1 is over there.
Hello, Isabel. Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you for your presentations. I had a very quick question. So we've spoken about good jobs. Could you please help us understand how are we defining these good jobs? Is it in terms of formal versus informal? Is it based on sector, labor productivity? Yeah, just that's, thank you.
2. There's another question.
I was interested in the perspective of international development cooperation. So which components of the 3 Ps do you think governments can't do by themselves if they want to? So one classic response is export-led expansion, right? That needs international cooperation. I was recently at a conference on development and finance, and it was a general sense of gloom that we're moving away from a consensus on openness. So I was wondering if it's not that, you said don't give up on trade, but if it's not that, then what components of the 3 Ps do we need international cooperation for the most?
So this is a question for His Excellency. I've taken the bait, so I have to ask the question around public-private partnerships. And I'm asking it from the South African perspective. So advise. So serving in an advisory capacity to 2 of our former ministers of finance, there was an attempt to privatize, which didn't occur, and what instead occurred was a period, as you will know, of state capture, so wanton destruction. So the question is really the counterfactual that we have is one where states are unable to govern and run and render profitable state institutions, infrastructure and other sort of potentially profitable enterprises intrinsic to economic growth. So my question really is, how can the counterfactual work if you think PPPs are dysfunctional?
Okay, very quickly, and then we close it.
My question is regarding the governance system of the 3 Ps, because usually we at the ILO, we talk about tripartism, about how everything is negotiated, the social dialogue between employers and workers. What is the governance system that is going to manage these 3 Ps? For the definition of the good jobs, we at the ILO, we always have the decent work. And the definition of the decent work, this is where we define the good jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just 2 quick observations. I guess I get stuck with the productivity argument because I'm a firm believer in productivity. I've been studying it for 30 years. But the argument that I would say is, how do you achieve that growth? It's not about the level of growth, but how we achieve it. So when you look in the case of the Philippines, where I was the director for 5 years, we saw the transformation moving to creating jobs, wage and salary jobs. And there we saw 60% of the labor force engaged, but we still had 40% in unregulated sectors. So when you take the position of we want productivity, we want economic growth, but we do it through how we deal with the labor component to achieve that growth, that's the main driver. So I also take the minister's comments as well, because I thoroughly believe it's about how we achieve it. So it's just not about creating work. But it's also, I want to be clear, it's not just about wages or earnings. It's about those conditions of work that matter, because you want them to be sustainable. So I take both points, but I think we really need to define what we mean about how we achieve growth. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. So, Your Excellency, would you like to start responding? since you got a few questions directed to you.
They're all very interesting and very deep questions that require a lot more time than our boss is going to allow us. So allow me just to focus on only two of the four excellent questions that were raised. On the PPP story, governments in general, in the Middle East or anywhere else, do not have enough resources, public resources, to, let's say, create the infrastructure that they need. So we know that. Domestic saving, there is always a saving investment gap. They need extra resources, that's to begin with. Second of all, the government budget itself is always under pressure, and there is always a deficit. So the need for private sector participation is not something that you can avoid easily. So that's a starting point. Now, the interesting question comes next. How do you go about it? There are multiple ways of doing it. You have two examples. One is the example of Chile, where they provided a policy and a regulatory framework that's a solid one, that has the features of competition, regulation of the segments of the markets that are monopolistic, creating independent regulatory agencies, and basically inviting the private sector to participate under these common conditions. That's one approach. The other approach is to strike a contract, call a Siemens, or call, I don't know, whatever company you want, and make a deal with them. So essentially what you're doing when you make these specific transactions is that you are embodying the regulation and the policy environment in the contract. We know from theory that contracts are imperfect by definition. You cannot, no one can, predict what is going to happen tomorrow and cover all the eventualities in the contract. So by definition, you are bound to make a mistake every time you go the transaction route. My suggestion and belief and conviction is that the Chilean approach provides the right policy and regulatory framework and that implies the private sector to operate under these common rules without differentiating between them. This is how you maximize, you give credibility. The person who is putting their money in an infrastructure, they are asset specific, they cannot run away. You are giving them the comfort of these are the rules that are going to be respected in the future. You are protecting the consumers and you are planning for the future. It doesn't get any better. So that's my bias. I might be wrong, but at least that's what I believe in. Let me say something about the last point our friend made here about, it's not only about, I made 2 points. It's not only about growth and it doesn't matter, it's going to create jobs automatically only, and it's not only about distribution, he's adding one more thing. It's how you do it that's important. How you go about creating jobs. 2 points to make there. One of them is the dominance of the informal sector in most countries, in most developing countries, not just the Middle East, as a matter of fact. And I don't think anyone has a good handle on how to motivate the informal sector to move to the formal sector voluntarily and stay there. Most people think about tax exemptions or tax breaks. Nonsense. Because the fact of the matter is, the person who operates in the informal sector, a little entrepreneur who has a little boutique on the corner of the street, is very rational. They ask themselves, do I live in the shadow and make little money but guaranteed? Or do I go to the formal and be under the sun and the government will harass me in all sorts of ways, the least bothering of which is taxes? It's actually, the inspection and the safety and God knows what. The business environment in the formal sector is so discouraging to those who are already in the formal sector. Why the hell would I want to leave my little shadow and go to the other place? This is an issue that the World Bank has not given it enough attention, certainly not in the policy-making circles in the developing countries. The question of the quality also is a function of structural transformation. And I would argue that selective intervention or industrial policy in general, they call it industrial policy, but they really mean selective intervention. When the government starts differentiating between you and me, Basically, I give you a tax if in this sector, in that activity, in that whatever. This policy of selective intervention also has not received enough attention, and governments are addicted. They wake up every morning asking themselves, what do I give to this friend and deny this other friend? Every day, whether it's in the form of land allocation, credit allocation, and they do it as if they are doing everybody a favor. In fact, they are hurting everybody. The issue of structural transformation is a function of the selective intervention policies, and in most countries, selective intervention policies are where the problems lie. And that issue does not receive enough intervention. Quality of structural transformation is associated with the quality of jobs, and if industrial policy doesn't receive the attention that it merits, I think we will continue to be saying the same things, and nothing will happen. Let me just ask you, you have been asking us all the time, one question, and I would like you and our colleagues from the bank to try to answer. You guys come up with all wonderful recommendations that nobody disagrees with. You say that growth is important, quality of job is important, whatever, everything is important. And you tell us, introduce competition, allow private sector, unleash the potential of the private sector, all sorts of wonderful things. The trouble is the devil is lying behind, and you're not dealing with the devil. And the devil is the issues that you raised, the governance, the politics. In the US, when Clinton was running for president, they used to use a slogan called, it's about economic stupid. It is economic stupid. I would actually, I'm not running for anything, but I would say it's politics stupid. If we don't understand the politics, the prevailing governance and politics in a given country, and try to find, tailor, if you like, our policy advice to the nature of the bargain, the political settlement prevailing in a given country, I'm sorry, we are wasting your time. So could you please answer the question?
I think I'll let our regional director answer the question about politics. I'm happy to follow up after on some of the issues.
Maybe just quick reactions. Happy to answer more questions. I think on the first one, how do you define good or decent jobs? A lot of definitions is a scale, but I think the first one, it have to be well-paying jobs. It doesn't make sense for people to work one job and two jobs and still under the poverty. And then you go in the scale by looking for how all sorts of protections of risk against sickness, against old age, insurance, but this may happen only in the formal sector. The second question on the, I cannot resist to also have a comment on PPP. I'm not against PPPs, and we have seen very good examples of good PPP projects, maybe Queen Ali and Jordan, just one good example. But I agree with Dr. Ahmed. I have seen also so many of the bad PPPs, and they don't resolve issues by themselves. They are windows to corruption, and a lot of time it is unsolicited. But if the country doesn't have an ability to put transparent processes for the selection and for the treatment of contingent liabilities, then it's really messy and not very good. On your question on the international, which part of the international collaboration, I think for me, I don't know what other colleagues feel, would be the issue of the last of the places. Let me just pick on migration. It's become a toxic political issue. While we are arguing for free movement of funds and capital and trade and goods, but it's very difficult to, and it's obvious, it's not a big problem. All of these replacement theory fears are not, can we really come up with an international compact in which we allow free movement of labor through some sort of circular migration? Doesn't have to be people stay forever, but rather than they wash in the Mediterranean, I think some win-win schemes that like the receiving countries tend to benefit from, but this is one area I think you have a role also to make sure you present or you inject some viable policies that really address also the political fears, and that will be my, on the last question, actually as a development organization that we supposed to be apolitical, we don't go into the political, but we recognize a lot of these issues are really governance. Actually, in the Middle East and North Africa, we have a strategy, and first pillar of the strategy we call renewing the social contract. And we strongly believe that the old social contract, which basically I provide you jobs for life and provide you subsidies, but the part of the social contract you also limit ability to, has reached its limit and has not really delivered. And it's really, we're looking now into the big role of the state, and we're trying to push for limiting the ability of the state. We're not taking very dogmatic view on privatization, but creating a level playing field in which the private sector can still have a room to grow with these big elephants. And so I think we really, as much as possible within the constraint that we have as a development institution, are supposed to be apolitical. We very much recognize a lot of progress is not going to happen if you don't address upfront governance issues and concerns.
Yeah, the political economy. So keep getting warnings that we have minus, like 0 and minus minutes left. So I just give 1 minute to Raghi and 1 minute to Federico, and then we close it. Is that okay? Okay, let's go to Raghi first. Would you like to say one
Actually,
minute?
I don't think I have a lot to add at this point. I agree with a lot of points that have been made, but I don't want to keep people longer than they need to be. So thank you.
Thank you. Federico?
Thank you. Just to quickly complement Nadir's answer on the good jobs. So they start with jobs that pay more, but of course we recognize that that's just the beginning. But we are very encouraged to see that there is a high correlation between the jobs that pay more and some of these non-wage characteristics of good jobs that we can agree with, such as benefits and the protections. And if I may leave with 2 kind of research ideas, because this is an academic conference. So the first is to pick up on Your Excellency's point on the politics, and to go back to my point on East Asia. Why did the industrial policy in East Asia, where Party A was actually favored by the government, result in better outcomes than in most parts of the world? And let me not even speak of the Middle East, but of my own region of Latin America, where a lot of the industrial policy did not result in the creation of large number of better jobs. So what was it about the politics there? I mean, this is a question that has puzzled me, because I don't think there's an easy answer, but it's a great research question. The second research question go back to something that Professor Raghi said. When I worked in Malaysia as a country economist, there was a government project about creating more private daycares. They started giving people grants, both to opening daycares and for the people to have their children in daycare. And you had a very contemporaneous increase in women's labor force participation. So this goes back to the care economy. Of course, these are just correlations over time. If someone could actually do a very interesting study to show whether the Malaysia experience of expanding childcare actually drove these improvements, that would be an important contribution. So, thank you.
And Your Excellency, you pointed to industrial policies and the informal sector. There's also, I think, areas where we need to do more research. There is renewed attention in the bank to industrial policies. I'm not sure we're linking that closely to the jobs agenda. To informality is also how we make informal workers more productive. Of course, we would like to have everybody formal, but it's how you get there too, like to link. So at least we try to do more, but I think there are so many areas where we need more knowledge and more data, because very often we face data scarcity. So I think you would agree with me that the panel exceeded expectations in sharing very insightful feedback and views and experience. So if you can join me in a round of applause to thank them. Thank you very much, and again, apologies, we went a bit out of the time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Raghi. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Hope to
so
see
much
you
for such an
soon.
engaging and stimulating plenary session. Please head to the parallel sessions. They're going to take place on the left in the rooms. If you haven't done so, please take the flyer from the registration desk. It has a map that will direct you towards the parallel rooms. Afterwards, we will reconvene for lunch.
Let me give you my number. Please exchange numbers so that we'll take WhatsApp and your service.